Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome back to the Nixon Library. My name is Jim Byron, and I'm the president and CEO of the Richard Nixon Foundation, and you are all in for a special treat this evening. I want to begin by thanking all of our President's Council members and Associates Club members who make these American civics programs possible, especially Mike Crow. I want to recognize Mike, who is with us and has been a member with his wife, Vicki, since 1990. He was here on opening day, so thank you, Mike, for your support. Tonight, it's a real treat for all of us to hear from someone who knew and worked closely with President Nixon when he was known as the Sage of Saddle River, where he was living, of course, in New Jersey, outside New York City in the 1980s and into the 1990s. Dr. Monica Crowley served as foreign policy assistant to former President Nixon from 1990 until his death in 1994. She worked with President Nixon to prepare speeches and research material for his articles that he was writing. She also aided the former president in the research and writing of 2 of his 10 books, Seize the Moment and Beyond Peace. Beyond Peace was his final book, which I will say is definitely worth reading again today because his predictions about the relationships between China and Russia and the United States have all unfortunately come to fore. It's worth a read. Dr. Crowley wrote 2 bestsellers about her experiences, Nixon Off the Record and Nixon in Winter. She then continued her career as a regular panelist on the McLaughlin Group and the host of the nationally syndicated radio program, The Monica Crowley Show. From 2019 to 2021, she served as Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Public Affairs at the United States Department of the Treasury. And for her exceptional service, she is a recipient of the Alexander Hamilton Award, the highest honor bestowed by the department. She's been a popular television anchor and political and foreign affairs analyst for the Fox News Channel, Fox Business Network, ABC News, NBC News, and pretty much every other national outlet. She graduated from Colgate University and holds 2 master's degrees and a PhD in international relations from Columbia. What hasn't Monica Crowley done? Today, she is the host and namesake of the Monica Crowley podcast, which I encourage you all to listen to, and she is a member of the board of directors of the Richard Nixon Foundation. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome tonight Dr. Monica Crowley.
Hi, guys. Great to be here, and thank you for that extraordinary introduction, Jim. First of all, I have to say thank you for putting a timestamp on my time with President Nixon, 1990 to his death in 94, because there was one time a couple of years ago I was giving a speech like this, and the person mentioned that I'd worked for President Nixon but didn't put the time frame on it, and there was a woman sitting in the front row, and she's trying to do the math. She's trying to do the math, and she's sitting there and she's squinting at me. So at the end of my speech, she waves me over, and I go down to say hi, and she leans into my ear, and she lowers her voice, and she said, "I need to ask you a very important question." And I said, "Yes, what is it?" And she said, "Girl, who is your plastic surgeon?" And I said, no, you misunderstand, so thank you, Jim, and I should take Jim everywhere I go. He has done an extraordinary job with this presidential library and the Nixon Foundation, and I want to thank him for his kind words, but I was just talking to Julie Nixon Eisenhower a couple of days ago, and we were singing Jim's praises because he's so young, but he's so smart and dynamic, and really the critical element to running a presidential library is actually really caring about your subject. And Jim has huge affection, admiration, and respect for Richard Nixon, and it shows in every exhibit, every event that they do. This building would not exist now without him as such a success. So thank you very much, Jim. And thank you for inviting me to come and speak today. This is a very emotional homecoming for me. It always is when I'm here at the Nixon Presidential Library because the man meant so much to me personally. So I get emotional. I want to thank you all for coming out tonight to hear what I have to say because I'm going to share a couple of stories about my experiences with President Nixon. And then what I'd like to do is tease it out to where we are today. I don't know if some of you have seen the hour-long interview I did with Tucker Carlson for Tucker Carlson Today, but I stumbled upon something that brings the whole arc of the last 50 years together. And I want to talk to you today about it, because what happened to Richard Nixon in the early 1970s is echoing through to today. And in order to understand what is happening today, you need to go back 50 years and understand what happened to the great man in whose library we sit today. First, though, I do want to mention that I have been blessed now to have worked for 2 American presidents. I'm one of very few people. And thank you. And it truly is a blessing. From the time I was a little girl, I always wanted to work in a White House and work for a president I really admired. And Jim was kind enough to take me through the new exhibits, because I haven't been here in 10 years. And they've renovated the library, and there are all these new exhibits. So he was kind enough to give me a little private tour. And at one point in the library, there's a monitor of President Nixon resigning, August 9th, 1974. And it hit me in the gut, not just because I worked for the man and had huge love and affection and admiration for him, but because that resignation speech is my first active political memory. In fact, I opened one of my books with that memory. I was 5 years old at the time, and I was down the Jersey Shore with my parents, who were both Republicans. They raised me well. And we were having our summer vacation, and I remember just the impression on my little girl's brain of Richard Nixon's face filling the TV screen. And I remember my parents were both huge supporters of his, and they were crying. And obviously I couldn't piece together what was actually happening, but I just knew that they were upset. And so that was my first memory of anything political, and it happened to be President Nixon. And then all those years later, I ended up working for him, which was such a blessing and hand of God. And then, mid-career, I ended up working for President Donald Trump at the Treasury Department. So guys, Richard Nixon and Donald Trump, man, do I know how to pick them? I know how to pick. No boring presidents for Monica, okay? No William Howard Tafts for me, only the most controversial. And I want to string it all together, because a lot of people ask me what was it about both men that attracted me enough intellectually, politically, emotionally, to drop everything and go serve in their employ. And I think after giving this a lot of thought, that what struck me is that both men obviously were and are American patriots who genuinely wanted to improve the lives of the American people and America's standing in the world. And that would have been enough for me. But there was something else about both men, and they're obviously incredibly different people, but they have a couple of really big things in common. And to me, the biggest is that both men were ultimate outsiders. And we could talk about President Nixon serving in Congress and the Senate, running for governor, and then as vice president. But ultimately, Richard Nixon and certainly Donald Trump were both outsiders. They were spurned by the establishment, reviled by the press and the ruling class, never part of the in crowd, which is the swamp clique in which the real power in this country resides. No, instead they came from the outside, did not owe anybody anything, and sought to destroy the entire putrid, corrupt status quo and return the power back to the American people where it belonged. That's what attracted me to both men, where I gave up everything I was doing to go and serve them and their agenda for this country. So I want to tell you how I got both jobs, because they're great stories. So let's start with President Nixon. I'm a junior at Colgate University, and I'm majoring in political science, and I love it. It's great. But the courses are like the standard courses at the time, the presidency, Congress, and so on. And as I looked at the syllabus for the spring of my junior year, I saw a new course listed called national security. And I said, oh, there's something different. So I signed up for it. And wouldn't you know, the course was being taught by a brand new professor on the campus who happened to be one of 2 conservative professors on the entire campus. And I was pretty much the only conservative kid on the campus. So I took this course and I absolutely fell in love with the material. I just loved it. And out of about 70 kids in the class, I am proud to say I was the only one to get an A+. So I so loved it that I went to the professor at the end of the semester and I said, you know, I really love this and I'd love to build a career out of my passion for this material, American foreign policy and national security. So how do I do that? And he got up and he went to his bookcase and he pulled down 4 books and he handed them to me and he said, go home this summer, read them, and when you come back in the fall, we'll talk about what you learned from them and then how to build out a career. I said, thank you very much. So at the end of a semester, you're exhausted, obviously, and I looked at the 4 books, 2 of which were Kissinger's memoirs that are 1,500 pages long each, and I said, I'm not starting with those. And so I reached for the slimmest volume, which happened to be a book by President Nixon called 1999 Victory Without War. At the time, President Nixon was writing a new foreign policy book every 2 years. As the world changed, he'd update where the world was and what American policy was at the time and what it should be in the future. So that was his latest book, and I sat down and I devoured it. It was almost like reading a great novel. I could not put it down. So when I finished it, I took out a piece of paper and I wrote him a letter. And I ended up typing it out on an early rudimentary computer. Remember the old computer paper with the holes on the side? That was my letter to Richard Nixon. But, you know, the beauty of being so young is that I didn't overthink it. I just wrote from my heart. And I felt compelled to let that author know, regardless of who it was, that he had educated me and inspired me by writing this book, and that I wanted to build a career in this area more than ever after having read it. So I print out 2 copies on that old-fashioned computer paper, and I'm like, what am I going to do? How am I going to get this to the former President of the United States? So I ended up sending 2 copies. Richard Nixon's author's note in the book was signed to RN, and he dated it, and he put Woodcliff Lake, New Jersey, where his office was. And then I looked, and his publisher was Random House. So I sent a copy to him, care of Random House in New York, and another copy to him, care of the Woodcliff Lake Post Office. And wouldn't you know, he got both copies. He had a secretary at the time named Carmen. Carmen had a high school education. She was about 5 feet tall. She was a Puerto Rican girl from the Bronx. Nixon said to me that she was the best, apart from Rosemary Woods in the White House, Carmen was the best secretary he ever had because she was tough. She may not have had a sophisticated education, but she had street sense and common sense. And wouldn't you know that it was little Carmen who saw both of my letters, took one and said, Richard Nixon needs to see this. She's the one who put it on his desk for him to see. And about a month later, I went to my mom's mailbox. I was getting ready to go back to Colgate for my senior year. And I pull out this beautiful ecru stationery envelope, and it's typed very formally, Ms. Monica Crowley. And I open it up, and there is a handwritten note from Richard Nixon to me. I have it framed in my apartment. It's one of my most treasured possessions. And at the end of my letter, I put like a throwaway line like, Mr. President, I know you're very busy. I'm 20 at the time. I know you're very busy, but I would love to meet you in person and pay my respects to you. So at the end of his letter, he said, please call my office after Labor Day and we'll set up a mutually convenient time for you to come and see me. 20 years old, 21. So I did that. I bought a new Ann Taylor suit. Very proper, navy blue, very Republican, little Republican kitten heel. And I went to go see him, and do you know that the man gave me an hour and a half of his time? I was nobody. I was a college kid with an interest in American foreign policy, no money, no connections, no nothing. And he gave me an hour and a half of his time walking me around the world, talking to me about every corner of the globe and what American foreign policy was and what it should be in the future. We talked about American domestic policy and politics. And I left that office thinking that was it. But he wanted to keep up a correspondence. So throughout my entire senior year, and think back to your college days, you'd go to get your campus mail, and you'd have that little square box, right? So I'd go with my friends. They'd all either have wind tunnels, no mail, or they'd have campus trash mail, right? And I'd be pulling out notes from Richard Nixon, my campus mailbox. When I graduated the following May, that's when he offered me a job. And I ended up spending 4 years working with President Nixon as a foreign policy assistant. Not that he needed any help from me whatsoever, but I was there to assist with his books and his columns and his speeches. And it was the greatest adventure of my life, primarily because I was so young. Traveled around the world with him, met with all of the heads of state with whom he met, including Boris Yeltsin in Russia. And I'll never forget when we were coming into Moscow, we were about to land, and President Nixon said, "Monica, I got to talk to you." And I said, "Yes, sir, what is it?" And he said, "If I say to you that we need to talk," he's like, "get dressed." And I was like, "Well, of course I'm going to be dressed all the time." And he said, "No, I mean get dressed." Now, this was February in Moscow, so freezing cold. He said, "No, I mean get dressed. The hat, the gloves, the boots, put on your coat. We're going for a walk." And I said, "Makes no sense." And he went like this. Everything was being surveilled. Everything was being listened to. And if you go back and look at some of the photos when he went to Moscow in 1972, every time he and Kissinger needed to talk, they're outside. All of those photos are of them walking in the snow. So many incredible experiences with him. You think about the document dispute going on right now between the DOJ and President Trump. Well, there was a moment in time when President Nixon was, for 20 years, he was losing every Watergate legal battle, lost every one. The courts, the DOJ, they just went after him and he never won one case. Well, there was a period of time when I was working with him when I was very sick. I had mono, and I didn't want to give it to him, so I was staying at home. But I was on the upswing and no longer contagious, and he said, one day, he said, "Monica, I'm going to come see you." I said, "What are you talking about?" I was living with my mom, right? And my mom was like, "What? She's coming to the house? Are you kidding me?" Up drives President Nixon with his driver into my mom's house. And my mom was working, and I was there by myself, and I brought him in, and I had his favorite lemonade for him. And he had to call his attorneys. He gets a message, call his lawyers. So he said, "Monica, do you mind if I use your phone?" I was like, "Absolutely, use the phone." And he called his attorneys, and his attorney said, "Mr. President, finally, we have some great news for you." And Nixon said, "What is it?" During Watergate, he had personal documents, and it's all being disputed all over again with Donald Trump right now, but he had all these documents that were impounded by the government as part of the Watergate investigation. Well, the government kept those documents for 20 years, and finally a judge ruled that because they were his documents, the government owed him compensation for keeping them for 20 years. So he was like, "We won one? The government is going to pay me?" He couldn't believe it because he had never won any of these battles. And he won that one. And he hung up the phone. He was so genuinely happy. And Nixon was an intellect, and he was a heavy personality. He was a man of seriousness of purpose. But when he got that news, he just genuinely seemed lighter in spirit. And he looked at me and he said, "Monica, you have a piano, right?" And I said, "Yes, sir, we do." And he said, "Great, bring me to the piano." So I brought him to the piano, and he sat down, and as you all know, he was a great pianist, and he started to play Happy Days Are Here Again. It's one of my most favorite memories of President Nixon because of the absolute pure joy of being vindicated, at least in a small part, as to what happened. So he passes away, and I ended up writing 2 bestsellers about my experiences with him, which I'm very proud of those books, and I hope you'll all have a chance to read them. And then I went on to have a pretty successful media career. I'm very proud of that at Fox News, Fox Business, the McLaughlin Group, national radio, now my podcast. And I had been Donald Trump's, I think, very first media supporter. So we came down the escalator, June of 2015, and I said, he's going to do it. So within like 72 hours, I'm on with Bill O'Reilly, and then the next morning I was on with Don Imus. And I remember O'Reilly talking about Trump, who was this longtime friend, but he was dismissing him out of hand. This is a vanity run, forget it, he's going to be gone in 3 weeks, this is just meant to elevate his brand. And I looked at O'Reilly and I said, live on national TV, I said, stop laughing, do not underestimate him, he's going to pull the whole thing off. And O'Reilly did a double take because O'Reilly knew me enough to know I would not play this game if I weren't serious. I never said anything on national television that wasn't true. So he sort of looked at me, and do you know, Donald Trump was watching that night. He watches a lot of TV. He was watching that night, and throughout the entire campaign, every time I'd see him, Trump would make a beeline for me and scoop me up and plant a kiss on my forehead, and he would say, Monica, you were with me when everybody else was mocking me, dismissing me, making fun of me. He said, you always got it. And I said, yes, Mr. President, I always did and I always will. And he said, well, I'm going to take you with me no matter where I go, no matter what happens. So I ended up in May of 2019 getting a call from a good friend of mine named Tony Saig, who was the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Public Affairs, which is a position that requires you to help draft the economic messaging, not just for the Treasury Secretary and the Treasury Department, but also with the entire administration. And he said, I'm here 2 years and I'm going to go. So I thought of you for this job. Are you interested? And I said, am I interested? Absolutely. So I ended up going down to Washington for 2 years, and I remember being sworn in by Secretary Mnuchin, and Tony then walks me to my new office at Treasury, and that building is spectacular. If you haven't been to either the White House or Treasury, go and do a tour. It's extraordinary. And I remember looking at Tony and saying, oh, this is going to be great. I mean, this job is going to be so easy because the Trump administration, the economy is booming, so you're giving me this great sales job to do. I don't have to do any work. The economy speaks for itself. It's thriving. And I looked at Tony, I said, my friend, do not stick me with a crappy economy, right? Don't worry, Monica, it's thriving, it's booming like never before. I'm like, yeah, I know. And so for the first year, it was unbelievable, and then March of 2020 happened. And I said, not only is this a crappy economy, this is an unprecedented economic catastrophe. Being in the Trump administration during both the economic boom and then the lockdowns and then the recovery was an extraordinary arc. It was obviously an economic journey for the American people, and certainly for the White House. President Trump said that the decision to shut down the US economy, which was booming, was the most difficult decision of his presidency. And I remember early March of 2020, Secretary Mnuchin kept a very small senior staff. There were only 12 of us, around that. And he called a meeting and he closed the door. And I remember looking around the room thinking, the 12 or 13 people in this room are going to have to save the US economy. And we did. And I'm very, very proud of what we did. It was not without issues and problems, as we all know, but it was also an unprecedented situation. The President of the United States, the Treasury Secretary, nobody could pick up the phone and call a predecessor and say, what did you all do during the last pandemic? It didn't exist. So they were all flying without a net. And we literally worked around the clock for months on end, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to try to save the US economy and get us through that stopgap period of time. So that's how I got both jobs. And I remember about 5 or 7 days into my job at Treasury, my personal cell phone rang. I had a government phone, and then I had my cell, and my personal cell phone rang while I was at my desk, and I was still getting my sea legs in the administration, and it came up and it said unknown caller, which I never answer, the unknown callers. So I blew it off and I kept working, and about 2 minutes later, it rang again, unknown caller, and I'm like, who is bugging me, trying to work for the American people, what's going on? This time they left a message, and the woman said, this is so-and-so in the Oval Office. I have the President of the United States calling for you, Monica. Please call us back at 2:02. I'm like, oh, so I ran, I closed my door, I called back, and she said, oh, just a minute, he wants to talk to you. So, Monica, thank God you're finally here, he said. And it was a lovely conversation. And then he says to me, Monica, you won't believe this. I said, what is it, sir? He said, nobody told me I had to hire 30,000 people. 30, he goes, I thought it was more like 300. This was honestly the Achilles heel of the Trump administration was the personnel, because there were so many Obama holdovers and others who were part of the permanent administrative state who had burrowed into the administration. There were also a lot of never-Trumpers who got their way in and stayed. And all of these people were undermining the President of the United States in real time. And a lot of them are infamous now. We all know their names. But there were countless numbers. So for every Monica who was a loyalist, there were like 10 deep staters in the administration cutting them off at the knees. And this brings me to tying it all together. And again, I spoke to Tucker Carlson about this for like an hour on his Tucker Carlson Today show. It struck me recently that what happened to Richard Nixon is exactly what is happening to Donald Trump, and for the exact same reason. So both of these men were outsiders, cannot be controlled by the ruling class, the deep state, the permanent bureaucracy. That group of people has an absolute grip on power in this country, and they will not cede that power without a fight. So they want people, they want a president who's either a Republican or Democrat, but someone that they know, someone that is one of them, and someone that they can control. And the reason for that is they don't want to lose their grip on power, but they also don't want to lose their entire corrupt gravy train, which is dependent on keeping America's problems festering, just bubbling beneath the surface, whether it's illegal immigration or economic problems or crime. They don't want it to overflow the way it is now under Joe Biden. Now this is a historic catastrophe. But for decades, the people who actually wield the actual power in Washington and in the country just want to keep it below a boil. Why? So that they can come to the American people every 2, 4, 6 years and ask for your votes and your money and claim, well, if you just give me one more term, we'll fix it in the next term. This is how they stay in power. They don't actually want America's problems solved because that puts them out of business and that dries up the gravy train. So the permanent Washington, the permanent deep state, the regime, if you will, always wanted people that they could control, and they succeeded for a long time until Richard Nixon came along. And remember, Dwight Eisenhower warned about the military-industrial complex. This is what the Ukraine war is all about, giant money laundering operation for the entire ruling class. He warned about it, Nixon comes along and he's a firebrand. He's an authentic outsider from right here, Southern California, doesn't owe anybody anything, is a true intellectual, and genuinely wants to solve America's problems. Can't have that. 50 years later, Donald Trump, even more of an outsider, genuinely wants to solve America's problems. Can't have that. Not allowed. So when you take a look at the last 50 years, and we are learning more and more about Watergate every day. There are some tremendous new books out that I recommend about the real root of Watergate. And again, this is not to excuse Nixon, some of Nixon's behavior during it, but understand that everybody coming to Nixon during Watergate had an agenda. And they were all spinning lies, either to protect themselves or to advance the deep state attack on Nixon. So Nixon was in the position of making a series of judgment calls and decisions based on the bad information he was getting from John Dean and everybody else who was deeply involved in this whole conspiracy. But it was, make no mistake, a conspiracy to remove the president. Again, because Nixon posed an existential threat to all of them. Why? He was making peace. Vietnam, détente with the Soviet Union, the opening to China for geopolitical reasons, starting to put all of them out of business. And in the second term, what Nixon wanted to do is exactly what Donald Trump began, which is to expose the permanent administrative state, the deep state, expose the depth of their corruption, their lies, their hypocrisy, their disgusting self-regard and self-dealing. Nixon started to expose all of that rot. And in a second term, he was literally going to reform the entire executive branch, which Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, a Democrat of New York who was very close to President Nixon, famously said that the executive branch needs to be reformed every 20 years for this very reason. Because if you allow it to go on, the corruption becomes so entrenched that it's going to be impossible to uproot. And you will get a deep state, and you will get this kind of sick perversion of government that we're seeing now. So Moynihan, told Nixon this, and he said, look, after World War II, we did it around 1950. It's now 1970. In your second term, think really clearly about how you want to remake the executive branch. And so in his second term, Nixon was going to do exactly that. Can't allow that, right? Because then they would be out of power. So, solution, destroy Richard Nixon, remove him from power. And they succeeded. I'm not saying Nixon didn't give them the sword, the famous David Frost interviews, I knew I had enemies and I gave them the sword. After Donald Trump was elected, in the spring of, 2017, I wrote a column for the New York Post, and I used the Nixon example. I was writing directly to President Trump in that column, and I said, Nixon said he had enemies, and unfortunately and sadly, he gave them the sword, and they used it. And he said, I couldn't blame them for using it. Of course, I handed them the ammo. And I said, Mr. President, do not give your enemies the sword. And you want to know why? Because the enemies are exactly the same. Faces change, people die, they leave government service, but I'm talking about the institutional enemies are exactly the same. That never changes. All of this new research that we're getting on Watergate, Mark Felt, deputy director of the FBI, the CIA was involved. You don't think that was a deep state maneuver against Richard Nixon? Of course it was. Of course it was. And once they got Nixon's scalp, game over. Because now there was blood in the water and they knew they could succeed. And so they took that victory and they put it on steroids. And they targeted every single existential threat posed by a Republican, and they went right for them. Think about it. Robert Bork, got him. Clarence Thomas, almost got him. Ronald Reagan, Iran-Contra, almost got him. George W. Bush, war criminal, almost got him. Brett Kavanaugh, the list goes on. And of course, Donald Trump is the biggest of them all since Richard Nixon. And he might come back. He might come back. So their war against him continues. The Russia hoax, 2 fake impeachments, January 6th, now the stupid document dispute. They have thrown the kitchen sink at this man. Nothing has stuck, which drives them even crazier and makes them lash out even more. But remember, like Nixon, Donald Trump is there to serve us, right? Every president has a big ego, okay? I don't want to hear anything like, oh, you know, he's got such an ego or mean tweets. I would kill for a mean tweet right now. I don't know about you. I'd kill for a mean tweet and $1.80 gas. I can't believe being in California. I have not been in California in years. $7 gas, guys? I don't know how you're living. I mean, I honestly, in New York State, it's $5, which is bad enough, but I don't know how you're all surviving here. Being in California is like being behind the Iron Curtain. And I say that from New York, which is bad enough, right? Trump came in, like Nixon, to disrupt everything. And they got Nixon, and then they're targeting Donald Trump, again, for the same reason, same group of enemies. But there's something else going on here, too. And that is that all of these attacks are shot across the bow. These are all messaging events by the deep state. And the message is to any other aspiring disruptor to the American system, don't even think about it. Don't even try it, because we will cut you down as brutally and viciously as we did to Richard Nixon and Robert Bork, and as we're trying to do to Donald Trump. It takes a very, very strong individual to go up against the deep state like this. Thank God for Donald Trump. Thank God for him. I mean, his rallies are as fresh today as they were in 2016. And he seems to be aging in reverse. He's like Benjamin Button, going backwards. And he'll do a rally now. I mean, the man is what, 75, 76, something like that. And it's 2 hours of stand-up. He does policy, but he's also telling jokes, and he's feeding off the energy of the crowd. That drives the deep state even crazier. And they redouble their efforts to try to get him. They will, you know, I saw the president a couple of months ago, and we had a long meeting together and a lot of laughs, and I said, Mr. President, you don't have to tell me if you're running again. I said, just know that I stand ready to help you as always. And he's like, Monica, I know. And he's like, you're coming with me, don't worry. And then, which is what he said originally. But I said, Mr. President, you do realize that they will burn down the country again, right? And he kind of did a double take, and he looked at me. I said, they're going to burn down the country again. But here's the kicker. When people say, what kind of Republican field are we going to have? It may be a wider field than we think. I do think Donald Trump is running again. I do. My view of this is, because we're dealing with such a vicious enemy from within. And make no mistake, we could talk about China if you've got some questions about how Nixon would view China, which is the top question that I always get. We could talk about all of the threats coming at us, but to me, the most dangerous threat that we face is the weaponization of our own government against us. That is happening right now. It's happened for a very long time. Look, the FBI and CIA illegally targeted Richard Nixon 50 years ago, right? And they continue to target Donald Trump. So dealing with that enemy that's within, it's like the horror movie, you know, the monster is inside the house, the call is coming from inside the house. Exactly. So given the nature of that threat, you might as well go with the ultimate fighter who has been through the fire before and knows exactly what's coming at him, and that's Donald Trump. So regardless of what you think, and look, he may choose not to run again, or they may tie him up legally in knots, and he might not be able to do this again. But whomever we nominate has got to have a full understanding of the nature of the attack that will be leveled against them. They're going to burn down the country regardless of who we nominate. Whether it's Trump or DeSantis or Mike Pompeo or whomever, doesn't matter. They're going to burn down the country again, and here's why. Not just because it's a Republican, but they have been working on this grand project to remake America for decades. This is a neo-Marxist revolution that we are living through with fascist tactics. But make no mistake, this is a neo-Marxist revolution. It's been going on for a very long time. It started as a KGB operation in the 1930s to destroy the United States. And in the 1930s, the Soviet Union thought, well, we've got to destroy America. How are we going to do it? And they came at us straight. And they realized this country was so strong and impervious to that, with such a durable constitution, that they couldn't do it like that. And then World War II came, and we were essentially on the right side together to defeat Hitler. But then after World War II in the 1950s, they said we need a new strategy to defeat America. And they came up with an absolutely brilliant one that's worked, which is infiltrate the United States from within and grab control over the major pillars of American life and society. The news media, academia, they started at the college level and then all the way down to now kindergarten, being indoctrinated, and the culture, movies, television, music, Broadway, theater. They grab control of those pillars, and I always use the analogy of the termite. I don't know if any of you have been unfortunate enough to have termites, but termites infiltrate a wooden structure, and they chip away over a long period of time, just eating and eating and eating. And to the naked eye, the house looks fine until one day it collapses in on itself. And that's where we are in this moment right now, because they have been doing this for decades. Barack Obama came in. He was an obvious socialist, okay? Now I remember going on with Bill O'Reilly and all these other guys and using the word socialism to describe what was happening under President Obama. And O'Reilly would look at me, oh, Crowley, you're crazy, socialism. What are you talking about? No, come on. Really? Come on? Yeah, exactly. And by the way, I put that back in O'Reilly's face recently. I was like, Bill, I want a full apology. He was like, yeah, you're right. And I had a whole chapter in my last book, What the Bleep Just Happened, about Obama, and I called it, The Skinny Socialist is a Big Fat Liar. And I remember going on with Don Imus, and he's like, Monica, what kind of title for a chapter is this? And I said, Don, tell me where's the lie. He is skinny, he is a socialist, and he is a big fat liar. But now the word socialism sounds too soft. It's too soft. We are in a neo-communist revolution, again with fascist tactics being used against us, but that is exactly what's happening. And again, it's been going on for a really, really long time. So the question is, how do we fight back, right? Obviously, you see Trump totally fearless as a fighter, but what do the rest of us do? And I know a lot of times we feel very helpless about it all, like what can one person do? But I'll say a couple of things on that. First of all, step one, like with any 10-step program, is acknowledge that there is a problem, right? And a lot of people, and I understand the cognitive dissonance, a lot of people don't want to process the idea that one of our two political parties has been taken over and is actually an enemy of the state. They use projection all the time, from Biden right on down. They accuse us of what they themselves are absolutely guilty of, okay? So once you have that in mind, you can't unsee it. I also say on my podcast a lot that this is a spiritual battle. It's God versus the enemy, and we're pawns in the middle of this, but there's something bigger going on here, and it's very dark what's happening. So I always encourage people just to keep that in mind and keep God first, because when you keep God first, then the rest of it, you feel empowered to take on. But understand that we are in a war for our country. The other side is literally at war with the Constitution and free market economics, individual liberty and economic freedom. They fight that war 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They never stop. And therefore, we can't either. So the recognition of the war needs to be fought now before things get even worse and it becomes even more painful to fight that war. And I think everybody in this room understands that. You're at your battle stations, which is great. The other thing I would say, too, is to get involved locally. And I know you're here in California. It seems like a hopeless cause, but it's never without hope. And, the left, specifically George Soros, with his money and his resources, they have burrowed in at the local level for a long time, taking over mayor's offices, district attorney's offices. I know you've got Gascon out here. We've got Alvin Bragg in New York. They're all over the country, letting violent criminals go because that's what communists do. One of the first things Lenin did, arriving in the Soviet Union, opened up all the jails. There is a reason. Stop looking for a rational reason. The reason is that they are engaged in a communist revolution. That's it. So they've taken over school boards and all of these local offices. So now it's our turn, now that we're awake to it. And I would say, we've seen some great success in deep blue areas like San Francisco, Chicago, New York, school board level, where parents have been turned into enemies of the state for just caring about their kids. Well, now we've got conservatives turning out these radicals in these elections, again, in the most unlikely of places. So I would encourage all of you to lend your time, your money, your expertise, whatever you can afford to give, to get involved locally, whether that means running for the school board or supporting new members of the school board, or whether that means making sure that we have election integrity at the local level. That means volunteer to be an election observer on election day, or I guess it's election month now, which is insane. But volunteer your time to do that. If you're an attorney, for example, volunteer. If there are legal challenges in your district, volunteer to step up and take on those cases. We need every hand on deck. And the other thing I'll say about this is that there has been a massive realignment going on, certainly since Trump was elected in 2016. That realignment includes disaffected Democrats, and also what we've seen over the last couple of years is a massive shift of Hispanic voters to the Republican Party because Hispanic values are conservative values and vice versa. They are leaving the Democratic Party in droves. You also see some slippage for the Democrats among black voters and some around women, although the Dobbs decision may have changed that calculus a bit. But Latino voters and black voters are giving the Republican Party another look. It is absolutely critical that we lock in that realignment as well as we can. And that means talking to your friends and your neighbors and your family, and we need to be an exponential amplification force, a force multiplier, in order to lock in that realignment and make sure that there's no backsliding. So we are in a precarious moment for the country. And I think about Marshal Foch, who was a French general in World War I. He was surrounded on all sides by the German advance. And he sent a telegram back to headquarters, and he basically said, I'm paraphrasing, but he basically said, I'm being attacked on the right, my center is yielding, my left flank has fallen apart. And then he said, situation excellent, I attack. It's our turn to look at all the devastation around us and say, situation excellent, we attack. And that's exactly what both President Nixon and President Trump would expect and want from all of us. Thank you so much. God bless you. God bless America.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you so much. a standing ovation at the Nixon Presidential Library. It means so much to me. I hope he's up there watching us and smiling down on us. I think he is. All right, so we've got a couple of questions, Nassim.
Right, yeah, so we're going to go to Q&A right now. If you have a question, please raise your hand or signal to me, and I'll come and get you. The first question is something I would like to ask very quick.
Yes.
What is one characteristic that is similar between President Nixon and President Trump?
That is a great question. I think, getting back to my original point about how both of them were outsiders, but that authentic love for America and wanting to serve the country, not serve themselves, not get rich off the American people or rich off their office, but this genuine sentiment that this is a great country, an exceptional country. President Nixon and I used to talk about American exceptionalism all the time. That genuine love for America drove both of them. And yes, they were both personally ambitious. Every president is. Every president has a healthy ego, of course, and that's what you want in a president. You don't want some little wimp running the free world. But what motivated them, like actors always talk about their motivation, what motivated the two of them was this genuine concern in preserving America's greatness. Ronald Reagan once said, American freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. Thomas Jefferson once said, American freedom needs a revolution every generation, right? And refreshing it with, he used a little bit of violent imagery, I think, there, but refreshing that American revolution with every generation to keep it fresh and alive. Nixon and Trump understood that in different ways. Richard Nixon was a true intellectual. He was a loner. He liked to read. In fact, I was sharing the story with Jim at dinner, where President Nixon, on the very first day of his presidency, right after he was sworn in, they get back to the White House, and he calls in his chief of staff, Bob Haldeman. And he said, Bob, I have a very specific and important instruction for you. He said, okay, Mr. President, what is it? And he said, Bob, every day I need you to build in 1 hour in my schedule of absolutely nothing. And Haldeman kind of looked at him and he said, what do you want to do with that hour? Do you want to take a nap? And Nixon said, I'm not Churchill. I'm not going to sleep in the middle of the day. He said, what I want that hour for, of no meetings, no phone calls, no interruptions, I need an hour to think. Do you know how simple and yet how profound that is? American presidents now, they're pulled in a million different directions, and Nixon was too. But he really put his foot down, and I'm sure it didn't happen every day, but he wanted to make sure that he had an hour every couple of days to just sit in silence and think about the state of the world, how the world was moving together, all of the moving parts. And in America, domestically, where things were going, how could he anticipate what was coming down the road? You can't do that if you're on your phone and you're doing a million different things. That was a very wise move by President Nixon. Trump was not that way. Trump is a very social animal, and whereas Nixon, I think, found people draining, emotionally draining, Trump, like Bill Clinton, found people energizing. He derives energy from people. So there was a constant stream of activity and people in his ear. Donald Trump, on the other hand, is the best instinctual politician I have ever seen. I'm talking a visceral sense of where the country is and where the American people are, and can communicate in crystal clear, charismatic ways to the American people. I would also say that absolute fearlessness on the part of both of them, again, in different styles, but there was a fearlessness in their fight for America. Hope that answers your question.
It did. Next question right over here.
Might be naive, but you said he had to hire 30,000 people. A good leader, to me, delegates. Why didn't he delegate into these different departments, these 9 or 10 people per department against him, and root them out?
Yeah,
Get them out of there.
That did happen. So every agency is now sprawling and huge, and we really need to reduce the size of government. No president ever does it. I think if Trump is reelected, he is going to take that on. I mean, I think he is going to decimate the entire corrupt administrative state, starting with the DOJ and the FBI, which, yes, needs to be razed to the ground. I don't think it can be reformed. I think it's so shot through, and the depth of corruption is so extreme that I think you need to and you need a president with the stones, pardon my language, to do it. Donald Trump will do it. And there might be other Republicans, Ron DeSantis might do it as well, but I'm saying, like in the Trump specific case, he will do it because he understands. There is something called the PPO, which is the President Personnel Office. So a lot of people who wanted to enter the administration, you all have to go through PPO. At the beginning, the PPO was not, they were vetting people to come in, but I think the magnitude of what, because remember, Donald Trump had never done any of this before. So a lot of the people around him had never done any of it before, and I think it was so overwhelming that the personnel question got away from them. And so a lot of people got in under the wire or just stayed from the previous administration. But really, that was the first fatal flaw because it was being undermined. But I think if there is a second Trump administration, or if there is a President DeSantis or someone else, there has been enough sunlight on this question that next Republican president, God willing, there will be one, will take that on and strip out as much of the fat and corruption as possible. Well, but remember, 4 years, yeah, but he had so much coming at him. Imagine if he didn't have the Russia hoax to deal with. First of all, the man delivered a booming economy, solved the border problem, basically solved illegal immigration, and delivered world peace. I don't know what more people want or expect from an American president. He literally did it all, but that's exactly why they needed to destroy him. Because he did it all. He exposed all of their nonsense, the depth of their corruption, their lies about, we're interested in solving America's problems when they weren't. Trump comes in, never does any of this before, and in 4 years is solving everything, despite being crippled by the Russia hoax, 2 fake impeachments, and the rest. Imagine if he had had a free hand. Imagine if he didn't have all this other nonsense tying him up. Imagine what he could have done for the country. And that's exactly why they needed to stop him and why they continue to need to stop him.
All right, so over here we got a two-parter question. I'm mixing both of them. They're a little bit shy, so I'll say it on the microphone.
Okay, sure.
Part 1 is, will you ever consider running? And part 2 is, if Trump were to run again, would you want to be working for him again?
Oh, that's so nice. Thank you for that question. So I talked to President Nixon about what I wanted out of my life and career. And I remember him saying to me, Monica, you'd be an excellent candidate. I was like, oh, thank you. He's like, but. At the time, he said, all of these people spend all of their time raising money. It's the constant campaign. Are you interested in that at all? I said, no. I was more interested in policy and having a broader impact. And he said, I think, Monica, knowing you, that you could get more bang out of your buck by going into the media and actually have more of an impact in the media than one of 100 in the U.S. Senate or 435 in the House. He said, you could run for governor of a state if you wanted to. He said, but my sense for you, because you're a good communicator, is go into the media and amplify the truth. And so I decided to go down that path, and it's been an extraordinary career, and I've been so blessed. To the second question about if Trump is reelected, 1,000%, I would go serve my country again in a second Trump administration. Thank you. Thank you. And when I say serving America, I mean serving all of you, all of us normal Americans who are not revolutionaries, who just want to bring our country back to its foundational principles, all of the things that made it great. I love my country. This country has been so good to me and my family over many years. I feel so blessed to be an American. And I was telling somebody the other day, last night at dinner we did the Nixon seminar in this room, And I was seated at dinner next to former Governor Pete Wilson. And he was telling me that he's on the board of the World War II Museum in New Orleans. And I said, do you know, I gave a speech at the opening of that World War II museum. And I was telling him how I had this whole speech. It was like a 3-page speech, nothing major, but it really came from my heart. So I have a special place in my heart for World War II veterans. And I got up, and there were literally thousands of World War II veterans who came for that museum opening. And I got up to the podium, and I consider myself a pretty cool customer when it comes to public speaking and television. And I got up like this, and I looked at these thousands of vets, some of whom were in wheelchairs, some were on walkers, but they had brought themselves to this opening. And I could not get through my speech. I was just bawling, crying. And I was telling Governor Wilson this yesterday, and he like grabbed my hand and said, thank you, you know. But that's the kind of love that I have for this country. It's deep, deep in me. And so if you're reelected, I will 1,000% go. Although I did tell President Trump, I was like, well, Mr. President, I already have the job that I want when you're reelected. And he's like, oh, great, Monica, what is it? I go, ambassador to the Bahamas. I want, like, you know, just bare minimum work, go to work in a bikini, I'm good. And he laughed.
All right, we have one last question right here.
Sure.
So I was hoping you were going to talk about this with in the Carlson show, but he didn't mention it. Do you have any additional anecdotes that you could share with us about President Nixon's experience with Elvis during their meeting?
Oh, Elvis Presley. Yeah. So great. So Jim Byron brought me through the library and museum right before we had dinner tonight. And I saw the huge picture of Nixon and Elvis plastered on the wall. It's a fantastic picture. And I think, Jim, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's the most requested presidential photo, right, of the two of them. Jim asked me if Nixon and I ever talked about it. I can't recall that we ever did, but I will say this. You know, Nixon said to me, and I wrote about this in my book, there was a day that I went to go see him at his house, and his study was on the 4th floor of his townhouse, and all the lights were out, and I'm coming up the stairs, and it was dark, but there was the flickering TV. So he's sitting there watching TV. And when I cleared the steps, I looked at what he was watching, and it was footage of the war in Vietnam, which was always a very emotional subject for him. And I have a whole chapter in my book, Nixon in Winter, about his final thoughts about that war. But I took a minute just to watch him watch the footage, and it was riveting to him. And I remember him saying to me, you know, he sort of gestured at the TV and he said, clicked it off, and he was like, you know, Monica, what's amazing to me still is that I got elected president when I did. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, 1968 was a crucible year in terms of the social upheaval and the counterculture and sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And he looked at me and goes, you know, Monica, I didn't quite fit that whole era. And then he took his fingers like this and he said, you know, Monica, I'm a square. He made a square in the air like that. He goes, I'm a square. And he said, for me to be elected at that moment in time when the country was going crazy and Woodstock and the assassinations and everything, he said it really was extraordinary. And I said, well, I think you were elected for a lot of reasons, not least of which was law and order. He was a law and order president, and the country there was a sense it was spiraling out of control, and people wanted a president to lay down the law, not unlike, again, what we are facing today, on a much more extreme and organized level with the Soros DAs, and this is an orchestrated attempt to destroy the country. So it's on a much more serious level now, and this is one of the other reasons why Donald Trump talks about law and order all of the time. It's basically the Nixon playbook because the situation is so similar. So think about it as you go home tonight. Think about the arc of history that I've talked about over the last 50 years. They say that those who ignore history are doomed to repeat it, right? And the communists know that. So therefore, so should we. Any other questions, or are we done?
That's it, ladies and gentlemen. Let's thank Monica Crowley. And thank you, Monica, for your service on the board and for all that you're doing.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you so much, guys, for coming out tonight. I really appreciate all of you, and thank you for being great warriors for freedom. God bless you. Thank you.